Hello, and thank you for taking a moment to watch this brief video providing an overview of the Desert Sands Unified School District's process for 504 plan evaluation and eligibility determination. During this presentation, we will be reviewing what criteria must be met for a student to be eligible for a 504 plan, what the evaluation and eligibility determination process looks like, and what to do if the 504 team feel they need to gather additional information to determine whether or not a student is eligible for a 504 plan. Let's start with a quick review of how a student qualifies for a 504 plan. There are three criteria or questions which must be addressed to determine eligibility. First, does a student have, or are they suspected to have, based on an evaluation, a physical or mental impairment? Does the impairment substantially limit a major life activity? And lastly, does a student require accommodation due to limitations caused by the impairment? All three of these criteria must be met for a student to be eligible for a 504 plan. And though the criteria may seem fairly clear, there is a good deal of consideration to determine eligibility. The first criteria is typically the most straightforward. Does a student have, or is suspected to have, based on evaluation, a physical or mental impairment? Section 504 of the Americans with Disabilities Act defines impairment by giving a few examples, such as any physiological disorder or condition, cosmetic disfigurement, or anatomical loss affecting one or more of the following body systems: neurological, musculoskeletal, special sense organs, respiratory, including speech organs, cardiovascular, reproductive, digestive, genitourinary, hemic and lymphatic, skin and endocrine, or any mental or psychological disorder such as mental retardation, organic brain syndrome, emotional or mental illness, and specific learning disabilities. The list of examples provided within Section 504 is certainly not exhaustive. And though the criteria for what is considered an impairment is fairly broad, the student must have or must be suspected of having an actual impairment. For example, behavior itself is not an impairment. If the student is engaging in inappropriate behavior due to an underlying anxiety disorder, then it would be the anxiety disorder that would be the qualifying mental impairment. Also, the Office of Civil Rights has clarified that a medical diagnosis is not required to determine 504 eligibility. If the student does not have a medically diagnosed impairment, the school would use its own assessment results to determine the student is suspected of having an impairment. The assessment to determine suspected disability would vary depending on details of the student's case. Prior to holding an eligibility meeting for a student who does not have a diagnosed impairment, please contact child welfare attendants for assistance. Lastly, it's also important to note that having a medical diagnosis does not automatically qualify a student for a 504 plan. Remember, all three criteria must be met to be eligible. The second eligibility criteria is whether the impairment substantially limits a major life activity. Section 504 includes a non-exhaustive list of major life activities as included on this slide. The determination of whether the major life activity is substantially limited must be made on a case-by-case basis. The team considers how significantly the impairment limits the activity compared to the student's peers and the impact it has on the student's access to his or her educational environment and their activities. It's important to remember to consider all activities that take place at school, not only academic instruction. The team must also consider whether the impairment is temporary. The Office of Civil Rights gives guidance that an impairment, which is anticipated to last less than 6 months, such as a broken bone, would not be considered to meet eligibility criteria for Section 504. The last consideration for eligibility is whether the student requires accommodation due to the impact of the impairment to access his or her educational program. Again, this must be made on a case-by-case basis, and all aspects must be considered, including the student's participation in extracurricular activities. A referral for 504 evaluation may come from a variety of sources. The referral may come from the school's student study team or Tier 2 team. It may come from a community member, such as a probation officer or a private counselor. Or the parent may request their child be evaluated for 504 plan eligibility. When a student is referred for evaluation to determine eligibility for a 504 plan, the best response is to conduct the evaluation and hold a 504 plan eligibility determination meeting. A single individual should not respond to a referral stating the student does not need a 504 plan. 504 plan eligibility is a team decision and is best made through reviewing the information gathered as part of the evaluation process. Remember, the team can hold a 504 eligibility determination meeting and find that the student is not eligible. Basing the ineligible determination off of a thorough review of student information gathered through the evaluation process is much more defensible than a single individual determining the student does not need a 504 plan. If you feel your school has a special circumstance and an evaluation should not take place, please contact the Child Welfare and Attendance Department prior to informing the referral source that the school will not be conducting the evaluation. Though there are no specified timelines within Section 504, the typical recommendation is to follow the same timelines of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, which is the federal law guiding students on IEPs. Section 504 often uses language such as reasonable when discussing timeliness. The concern of the student and his or her situation may dictate shorter timelines than typical. Per DSUSD practice, a 504 plan eligibility determination meeting should be held within 20 calendar days from the date of the referral. This will allow the team, if it is deemed to be necessary, to complete additional assessment within the recommended 60-day timeline from the receipt of the initial referral. Preparing for a 504 plan eligibility determination meeting is very similar to preparing for a student study team meeting. The 504 coordinator will determine a date and location for the meeting. They will send written notice to the parent along with procedural safeguards. They'll also gather documentation, including sending and collecting staff input forms to the appropriate staff. Staff should be selected to receive input forms based on the concerns of the student. For example, if a student is having behavioral difficulties outside the classroom, a staff input form may go to a noon yard supervisor or security agent who may be familiar with the student's behavior outside of the classroom. The 504 coordinator will also oversee the drafting of the evaluation report. This may be completed during the meeting, though creating a draft of the report prior to the meeting may help the meeting run more efficiently. The form is accessible by various staff when shared through Google Drive. The coordinator does not need to personally enter all the information and may choose instead to share out the report form to allow other staff to directly input their information. The 504 plan coordinator would also secure a translator if needed and work with site administration to determine coverage for teachers and other staff who may be participating in the meeting. When completing the 504 plan evaluation report, the 504 coordinator would begin by selecting the reason for the evaluation and mark what sources of data were collected and reviewed to complete the evaluation. All items collected and all items used to determine eligibility should be included. A comment section is available to provide additional information, such as the name of a doctor who may have provided a medical note, or to add a comment stating the psychoeducational evaluation was completed by the district and a note with the date of the evaluation. The next section of the evaluation report includes information regarding how the student is doing in his or her classes and other activities while on campus. This information will likely primarily come from the classroom teacher, though may also come from sources such as a club organizer, noon yard staff, or maybe even the office staff. Attendance and language status information would come from either Synergy or the student's cumulative file. Behavioral information typically comes from the staff input forms, though the 504 plan coordinator, particularly if the coordinator is also the school counselor, may have direct experience and information to include within this section. The school nurse and/or a review of the student's cumulative file will typically provide information regarding a student's physical health, while the counselor or school psychologist may have information regarding mental health. The student's parent will also likely contribute to this section. The last portion of the report is simply a list of all staff who contributed to the evaluation report. All staff who contributed information should be included, whether or not they were present at the 504 Plan eligibility determination meeting. Once the 504 team has had an opportunity to fully review the information and complete the evaluation report, the team then moves on to determine whether the student is eligible for a 504 plan. It's important for the team to carefully consider all three criteria and base the determination on the information available. When a student is determined to be eligible for a 504 plan, they receive various legal rights and protections. Eligibility determination should not be taken lightly, and eligibility should only be determined for students who truly meet all the criteria. To document the eligibility determination, the team would use the Notice of 504 Eligibility Determination form. The top of this form includes general information regarding the student and both reason and date of the evaluation meeting during which eligibility determination was made. Per the instructions near the top of the form, the team is to review the three sections of the form and select the most appropriate one based on the student's evaluation. Section 1 is completed when the team does find the student is eligible for a 504 plan. This means the team found the student to meet all three eligibility criteria. The 504 coordinator would complete Section 1 by recording the qualifying impairment, the major life activities which are substantially impaired, and the areas in which the student requires accommodation. Section 1 of the form includes a reminder to 504 teams that mitigating measures, with the exception of ordinary glasses or contact lenses, should not be part of the consideration of whether a student's impairment substantially limits a major life activity. For example, a student with ADHD may not require accommodation when consistently taking medication, but does require accommodation when he or she is not taking their medication. In such a case, accommodation should be written to support the student's need when not on medication. The team must consider the impact should the mitigating measures not be available. The last portion of Section 1 of the form requires the team to record which areas are in need of accommodation. This is not where the team lists the accommodation, but rather lists the areas in need of accommodation. For example, a student with ADHD may require accommodation in the area of behavior. A student with diabetes may require an accommodation to meet medical needs during instructional time. Section 2 is used when the team agrees a student has an impairment but does not meet the other criteria necessary for eligibility. The 504 coordinator would record the impairment on the form, then check the box next to the reason the student does not meet eligibility. Remember, per the note in Section 1, mitigating measures should not be part of the consideration as to whether the student's impairment substantially limits a major life activity. The team must consider the impact should the mitigating measure not be available. The third section of the eligibility determination form is where the team would record the determination that the student does not meet eligibility because the student was not found to have, nor was suspected to have, a physical or mental impairment. This concludes our overview of 504 Plan eligibility. All forms and the 504 Plan Handbook, which includes instruction on eligibility, can be found on the CWA Shared Documents folder on Google Drive. And as always, should you have any questions or need assistance, please contact the Child Welfare and Attendance Office at 760-771-8612. Thank you.